Thank you, Russ. Emerson opens his essay on the Oversoul by pointing to what we might call the golden moments of a human life. These golden moments give credibility to the fact that there are higher states of consciousness available to the individual. And the source of these golden moments can be attributed to the overbrooding nature of what we might call soul. Emerson's writings could be characterized as a collection of golden moments. And to appreciate them sufficiently, we must explore, however briefly, the manner in which he delivered them. The spiritual literature of mankind, which is the birthright and the inheritance of every human being born on this earth, is inspired literature and is accompanied appropriately by a certain poetic beauty. If you think of the shlokas of the Bhagavad Gita, the verses of the Dhammapada, the stanzas of Xian, the axioms of the Tao Te Ching, the logia of the Gospel according to Thomas, or the melodious passages of the Voice of the Silence, you cannot help but hear a distinct musical quality to the writing. If you were to read Plato in the original Greek, we're told, you would discover that his writings sound more like Shakespeare or Shelley than systematic philosophers like Hobbes or Hegel. Truly inspired writings, such as we find in sacred texts, has a cadence, a rhythm, and a melody that is unmistakable. This musical quality has a hidden, you might say even an occult power, to lift and elevate the receptive mind, the open heart. This capacity is one of the keys to appreciating the brilliance of Ralph Waldo Emerson. His intent was to inspire. His thoughts and writings are more like flashes of insight or collections of mystic moments, and less a geometrical proof or a rational explanation. He is a poetic rather than a systematic philosopher. And that is why it is important not only to read Emerson, but to listen to him as well. So it just so happens we've invited him into our proceedings today.
Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you, the society of your contemporaries, the connection of events. Great men have always done so, and confided themselves childlike to the genius of their age, betraying their perception that the absolutely trustworthy was seated at their heart, working through their hands, predominating in all their being. And we are now men, and must accept in the highest mind the same transcendent destiny, and not minors and invalids in a protected corner, not cowards fleeing before a revolution, but guides, redeemers, and benefactors, obeying the almighty effort and advancing on chaos and the dark.
Emerson is a man of contemplation in the classical sense. He ruminated and wrestled with the great issues of human life. He brought depth and breadth to the eternal questions. For some writers, it is said that the unit of thought is the page. For others, the paragraph. For Emerson, it is the sentence. And this accounts for why he is so widely quoted. He set his radar to the frequency of a higher life. His wife would recount on how on many occasions she would witness her husband rushing out of bed early in the morning. She could not help but ask, "What's the hurry?" "I must catch a thought, my dear. I'm going to catch a thought." Long morning walks were part of Emerson's daily routine, and he believed nature was his muse. We all know how a long walk has a meditative quality about it. The body and the senses are engaged while the mind is given a chance to work independently and with minimum interruption. This discipline was built into the fabric of Emerson's days. Emerson was often criticized for the disconnected nature of his prose, but his aim was not to convince or persuade, but instead to light a fire under the mind of his listeners and to encourage them to pursue their own explorations. The universal themes of these meditations, like the Oversoul, which is our topic for this evening, self-reliance, compensation or karma, cycles, nature, experience, these broad themes reveal the expansiveness of his thought. Emerson is, to use his own words, man thinking, capital M, capital T. And his ambition in life was to encourage this activity in others. And he did so in the latter phases of his life by offering lectures throughout the land during America's adolescence. He was considered by many as one of the finest orators of his generation. When we read Emerson, we find his spirit cheerful, amiable, optimistic, and introspective. The great naturalist John Muir met Emerson when he was a young man and said of him, "He is the most sincere man I have ever met, as sincere as the redwoods." Emerson was elegant, but not academic in his words. His intention was to make you feel the ideas as much as to understand them. This musical approach to his prose helped to create an atmosphere solicitous of intuition. His work tends to move from insight to insight, much like a symphony glides from movement to movement. There's a wonderful story about a simple, uneducated washerwoman who attended every lecture Emerson gave in Concord. Emerson's talks are very deep and rich in language, and for many could be hard to understand. A local reporter attending an Emerson lecture, and who had noticed her frequent attendance, could not help but ask her if she understood what Emerson was talking about. She replied, "Not a word, but I'd love to go and see him stand up there and look as though he thought every one of us was as good as he is." So from where does Emerson's love of and faith in humanity come from? He had plenty of evidence to the contrary concerning man's goodness. He lived at a time of great social unrest, filled with severe examples of man's inhumanity to man. His generation struggled with the institution of slavery, the Civil War, robber barons, and witch hunts. He experienced profound personal loss with the early death of his first wife, Lydia, who died 2 years after their marriage at the age of 20. His first son from his second wife, Waldo, died at the age of 5 from scarlet fever. So where does this abiding sense of optimism come from in the midst of such misery?
The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest. As the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other. That common heart of which all sincere conversation is the worship, to which all right action is submission. That overpowering reality which confutes our tricks and talents and constrains everyone to pass for what he is and to speak from his character and not from his tongue, and which evermore tends to pass into our thought and hand and become wisdom and virtue and power and beauty.
Emerson's idea of the oversoul suggests an overbrooding, omnipresent spiritual essence that defies explanation and confounds all our ordinary states of consciousness. Being omnipresent and transcendent, it is the voidness of the seeming full. Being immanent and within, it is the fullness of the seeming void, to borrow the words of the voice of the silence. The concept of the soul and the concept of the oversoul blend in and out of each other in Emerson's essay. And well, it should, if one would be the mirror and reflection of the other. Emerson makes it clear that the soul is not an organ, but the user of organs. He tells us that the soul is not the container of knowledge, but rather knowledge itself. It is the wisdom of the wise, as Krishna says in the Gita. He says that the soul is the source of perception itself. This is precisely where our training in theosophical philosophy comes to our aid. What we discover straight away in the first fundamental principle of the secret doctrine is the idea of the absolute, the causeless cause, pointing to a notion of radical unity from which the very idea of oneness arises. Mysteriously and metaphysically, this absolute is experienced by conscious beings in manifestation as the one law, the second proposition of the secret doctrine, signifying a unitary relationship between spirit and matter. This law that pervades all of nature and the I am I consciousness that wells up within every human being are both pointers to what Emerson calls the Oversoul. He is loath to define it and prefers to point to it, much like a child excitedly pointing to a butterfly alighting upon a flower. In the third fundamental principle of the secret doctrine, the relationship between the Oversoul and the idea of individual souls is brought to light in the secret doctrine. And this, of course, is the third fundamental principle, where she writes, the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal Oversoul, the latter being itself an aspect of the unknown root, and the obligatory pilgrimage of every soul, a spark of the former, a mirror of the former, through the cycle of incarnation or necessity, in accordance with the cyclic and karmic law, during the whole term. In other words, no purely buddhi divine soul can have an independent conscious existence before the spark which issued from the pure essence of the universal sixth principle, or the Oversoul, has A, passed through every elemental form of the phenomenal world of that manvantara, and B, acquired individuality, first by natural impulse, and then by self-induced and self-devised efforts, checked by its karma, thus ascending through all the degrees of intelligence, from the lowest to the highest manas, from mineral and plant to the holiest archangel, Dhyani Buddha. All individuals are reflections on a lower plane of this Oversoul. Let us not forget the original meaning of the word individual, or individus, meaning not divided or whole. The individual is a sevenfold being with one's higher nature reflecting the Oversoul. This metaphysical idea stands behind the Greek notion that man is the microcosm of the macrocosm. From this point of view, you might say, the Oversoul could be associated with the Atman in the theosophical scheme, and the individual soul, of which it is a reflection, is Buddhimanas. This curious idea that we are a self, all lowercase letters, within a self, capital S, within a self, all caps, is mentioned in both the Gita and the Voice of the Silence. Krishna says, we should raise the self by the self. Let him not suffer the self to be Lord. For self is the friend of self. And in like manner, self is its own enemy. Self is the friend of the man who is self-conquered. So self is like a foe hath enmity to him who is not self-conquered. The self of the man who is self-subdued and free from desire and anger is intent on the supreme self, in heat and cold, and pain and pleasure, in honor and ignominy. The man who hath spiritual knowledge and discernment, who standeth upon the pinnacle, and hath subdued the senses, to whom gold and stone are the same, is said to be devoted. And then in the voice of the silence, we are told, saith the great law, in order to become the knower of all self, thou hast first of self to be the knower. To reach the knowledge of that self, thou hast to give up self to non-being, being to non-being, and then thou canst repose between the wings of the great bird. Aye, sweet is rest between the wings of that which is not born, nor dies, but is the Om throughout the eternal ages. Now, Emerson mirrors these ideas in his Oversoul essay.
Man is a stream whose source is hidden. Our being is descending into us from we know not whence. The most exact calculator has no prescience that somewhat incalculable may not balk the very next moment. I am constrained every moment to acknowledge a higher origin for events than the will I call mine. As with events, so it is with thoughts. When I watch that flowing river, which out of regions I see not, pours for a season its streams into me, I see that I am a pensioner, not a cause, but a surprised spectator of this ethereal water, that I desire and look up and put myself in the attitude of reception, but from some alien energy, the visions come. And the blindness of the intellect begins when it would be something of itself. The weakness of the will begins when the individual would be something of himself. All reform aims, in some one particular, to let the soul have its way through us. In other words, to engage us to obey. Of this pure nature, every man is at some time sensible. Language cannot paint it with his colors. It is too subtle. It is undefinable, unmeasurable. But we know that it pervades and contains us. We know that all spiritual being is in man. A wise old proverb says, God comes to see us without bell. That is, as there is no screen or ceiling between our heads and the infinite heavens, so is there no bar or wall in the soul where man, the effect, ceases and God, the cause, begins. The walls are taken away. We lie open on one side to the deeps of spiritual nature, to the attributes of God. Justice we see and know, love, freedom, power. These natures no man ever got above, but they tower over us, and most in the moment when our interests tempt us to wound them.
Every woman and man has a direct and original connection to the Oversoul. But the degree to which it can shine without impediments on the lowest planes of existence is determined by the level of receptivity in the awakening heart and mind of the individual. In it, we live and move and have our being, yet we seem to know it not. In the words of the voice of the silence, alas, alas, that all men should possess Alaya, be one with the great soul, and that possessing it, Alaya should so little avail them. So there must be something blocking this connection. Something is interfering. After all, Alaya is the source of one's consciousness. It is the life and energy that animates all our various vestures and vehicles. You might say the goal of human evolution is to build a trustworthy bridge between the highest planes of being within so that they might be expressed at the lower planes of becoming. To establish and maintain this connection is the real object of the spiritual path. A stubborn, confounding, deflecting, and subtle separative sense of self is impeding the light.
From within or from behind, a light shines through us upon things and makes us aware that we are nothing, but the light is all. A man is the facade of a temple wherein all wisdom and all good abide. What we commonly call man, the eating, drinking, planting, counting man, does not, as we know him, represent himself, but misrepresents himself. Him we do not respect, but the soul, whose organ he is, would he let it appear through his action, would make our knees bend. When it breathes through his intellect, it is genius. When it breathes through his will, it is virtue. When it flows through his affection, it is love.
The very concept of soul in contemporary culture is a confusing one. In conventional religious circles, we get the idea of having a soul. It is considered some sort of appendage, which we can lose or gain depending on our standing with God. In psychological circles, the idea of soul is all too often reduced to some primitive collection of instincts, or at best, a nagging conscience related to emotional states. And materialistic science sees consciousness as a byproduct of the brain and has no use for the idea of soul. In contrast to these perspectives, the theosophical idea of soul is woven into the fabric of the idea of consciousness itself. In the modern theosophical movement, the term self has been introduced in the attempt to resuscitate the ancient notion of soul being something that one is and not something that one has. Emerson provides a useful stepping stone to help us connect to the deeper notions of soul found in the perennial philosophy. According to Emerson, the soul is related to the idea of the whole, the all. No part is left out. Everything is included.
We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is all accessible to us is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the things seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. We see the world piece by piece as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole of which these are the shining parts is the soul. Only by the vision of that wisdom can the horoscope of the ages be read. And by falling back upon our better thoughts, by yielding to the spirit of prophecy, which is innate in every man, we can know what it saith. Every man's words who speaks from that life must sound vain to those who do not dwell in the same thought on their own part. I dare not speak for it. My words do not carry its august sense. They fall short and cold. Only itself can inspire whom it will, and behold, their speech shall be lyrical and sweet and universal as the rising of the wind. Yet I desire, even by profane words, if I may not use sacred, to indicate the heaven of this deity and to report what hints I have collected of the transcendent simplicity and energy of the highest law.
What soul represents should not be given strict boundaries because it is a dynamic conception and can stand for various levels of the unmanifest and formless realms of being. Emerson is helpful in this respect because he communicates the ideas of the Gupta Vidya, the perennial philosophy, or Theosophia, if you will, without the aid of Sanskrit or Greek terms that are foreign to many of us. He is like a wise doctor explaining a surgical procedure to a patient using layman's terms. Some of the expressions Emerson uses in the Oversoul essay, like the wide silence, universal beauty, the soul of the whole, the eternal one, are all extremely suggestive and worthy of contemplation. The soul is self-contained, since it is the mirror of the whole. And therefore, to truly know the soul means we must rise up to it. A view of it cannot be attained down in the valley, but only at the mountaintop.
The soul circumscribes all things. As I have said, it contradicts all experience. In like manner, it abolishes time and space. The influence of the senses has, in most men, overpowered the mind to that degree that the walls of time and space have come to look real and insurmountable, and to speak with levity of these limits is, in the world, the sign of insanity. Yet time and space are but inverse measures of the force of the soul. The spirit sports with time, quote, can crowd eternity into an hour or stretch an hour to eternity, unquote. The soul looks steadily forwards, creating a world before her, leaving worlds behind her. She has no dates, nor rights, nor persons, nor specialties, nor men. The soul knows only the soul. The web of events is the flowing robe in which she is clothed.
In The Secret Doctrine, HPB praises Emerson's conception of the Oversoul and equates it with the Sanskrit notion of alaya, and the Latin term anima mundi, the soul of the world. Alaya is that universal essence that pervades everything from the minutest atom to the farthest reaches of the cosmos. This impersonal essence or esoteric energy is suggested in popular culture in the Star Wars idea of the Force, or the ancient idea of Qi, brought forward in the recent film Mulan. It is everywhere and nowhere in particular. It can be tapped. It is impersonal, meaning it is allied with the concept of law itself and cannot be petitioned or cajoled. These classical ideas, this classical nature of the thought of Emerson were radical in his own time, but they're really classical ideas. Much to Emerson's surprise, these intuitions, which he so prized and so painfully cultivated, and which were rejected as heretical from a pulpit on a Sunday morning, were intensely interesting when delivered from a lectern on Wednesday nights. Perhaps Emerson's buoyant spirit, lyrical expression, and non-threatening manner contributed to the reception. This does not mean that Emerson did not have his critics. Apparently, it was not uncommon for Emerson to be taken to task by religionists in his own neighborhood. But like Socrates before him, he was adored by the youth of the towns that he visited, who attended his lectures enthusiastically. They were captivated by the message of unbounded human potential, calls to self-reliance, and the democratic nature of his thought. What made Emerson the philosopher of the American spirit is the ancient universality, which is the birthright of all mankind. It is appropriate that a soul like Emerson might provide these seminal influences on a nation composed of representatives from every continent. Like Gandhi, and unlike fellow transcendentalist Thoreau, Emerson was a very difficult man to dislike. His magnanimity and kindness endeared him to many. In 1872, Emerson's home was almost totally destroyed in a fire. His wife and family escaped just in time to preserve their lives, but with a few of their possessions. Emerson's precious library was no more. And being of modest means, the family's prospects of restoring their home was in doubt. The city of Concord made a collection, crowdsourced, the necessary funds to send the 69-year-old Emerson and his oldest daughter on a months-long adventure to Egypt, while they secretly rebuilt the home and reconstituted the library. Such was the affection held by the people of this community for the Bard of Concord.
We have a great deal more kindness than is ever spoken. Notwithstanding all the selfishness that chills like east winds the world, the whole human family is bathed with an element of love like a fine ether. How many persons we meet in houses whom we scarcely speak to, whom yet we honor and who honor us. How many we see in the street or sit with in church, whom, though silently, we warmly rejoice to be with. Read the language of these wandering eye-beams. The heart knoweth. I awoke this morning with devout thanksgiving for my friends, the old and the new. Shall I not call God the beautiful, who daily showeth himself to me in his gifts? I chide society, I embrace solitude, and yet I am not so ungrateful as not to see the wise, the lovely, and the noble-minded, as from time to time they pass my gate. Who hears me, who understands me, becomes mine, a possession for all time. Nor is nature so poor, but she gives me this joy several times, and thus we weave social threads of our own, a new web of relations, and as many thoughts in succession substantiate themselves, we shall by and by stand in a new world of our own creation, and no longer strangers and pilgrims in a traditionary globe. My friends have come to me unsought. The great God gave them to me. By oldest right, by the divine affinity of virtue with itself, I find them, or rather not I, but the deity in me, and in them derides and cancels the thick walls of individual character, relation, age, sex, circumstance, at which he usually connives, and now makes many one. High thanks I owe you, excellent lovers, who carry out the world for me to new and noble depths, and enlarge the meaning of all my thoughts. These are new poetry of the first bard, poetry without stop, hymn, ode, and epic, poetry still flowing, Apollo and the muses chanting still. Will these two separate themselves from me again, or some of them? I know not, but I fear not, for my relation to them is so pure that we hold by simple affinity. And the genius of my life being thus social, the same affinity will exert its energy on whomsoever is as noble as these men and women, wherever I may be.
To see and live life from the vantage point of the Oversoul is the process of individuation, the sacred process of becoming the universal man. The transition from Kama Manas domination to Buddhi Manas orientation is another way to characterize the challenge or predicament of the human condition. Emerson would call this living life wholly from within, or self-reliance.
The key to every man is his thought. Sturdy and defying though he look, he has a helm which he obeys, which is the idea after which all his facts are classified. He can only be reformed by showing him a new idea, which commands his own. The life of man is a self-evolving circle, which from a ring imperceptibly small, rushes on all sides outwards to new and larger circles, and that without end. The extent to which this generation of circles, wheel without wheel, will go depends on the force or truth of the individual soul. For it is the inert effort of each thought, having formed itself into a circular wave of circumstance, as for instance, an empire, rules of an art, a local usage, a religious rite, to heap itself on that ridge and to solidify and hem in the life. But if the soul is quick and strong, it bursts over that boundary on all sides and expands another orbit on the great deep, which also runs into a high wave with attempt again to stop and to bind. But the heart refuses to be imprisoned. In its first and narrowest pulses, it already tends outward with a vast force and to immense and innumerable expansions.
And we'd like to close with one last quote from Mr. Emerson when he says, "I, the imperfect, adore my own perfect."